Welcome to the MASE podcast. My name is Evangelos Chimonides and I am Professor of Technology, Education and Music at University College London in the UK. In this podcast, I envisage to meet scholars, artists, practitioners and thinkers around the world and discuss their lives, their careers, their journeys, their challenges and their work on the intersections of music, the arts, the sciences and education. Professor Adina Mornell conducted doctoral studies in music psychology and instrumental music education at the University of Music and Performing Arts in Vienna. She is a graduate of the Technical University of Berlin with an MA in musicology, psychology and English literature, and she conducted her undergraduate studies in piano, psychology and literature studies at the Oberlin College and Conservatory of Music in Ohio in the United States of America. For 20 years, she was full professor and chair of instrumental and vocal music education, first at the University of Music and Performing Arts in Graz in Austria, and then at the University of Music and Theatre in Munich, Germany. As a guest professor, she taught and continues to teach at universities and higher education institutions in places such as Los Angeles, Vienna, Melbourne, and Zurich. Her lectures and workshops cover subjects including deliberate practice and the 3 stages of expertise: experts in stress situations, human factors and behaviour, causality models and error prevention strategies, stage fright and anxiety in musicians, as well as resilience and grit in handling both success and failure. In 2008, Adina initiated the biannual series of international and interdisciplinary symposia called Art in Motion. The last event was held in May 2025, focused on the drive to thrive, exploring what humans can learn from examples in nature and how to perform, compete and enjoy life with a healthy dose of motivation. Next year's event, the 10th Art in Motion, to be held in May 2027, in the city of Monheim, Germany, will explore the topic Body of Knowledge, what we know about the processes involved in motor learning and performance across artistic and athletic domains. Her career as a pianist includes multimedia projects and concerts for international companies and organizations, TV and radio performances, as well as CD recordings released worldwide. It is a great honor and pleasure to have Adina with me today for this episode of the MASE podcast, and this is our talk. Hello.
Hi, well, that's quite a background.
It looks like a background, but it's part of the real madness that is happening. But let me change the camera so that it's... there we go. That's much better.
Wow, okay. I was going to say that's going to be too distracting for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Adina, for joining me. It's fantastic to have you on board.
Yeah, I mean, I just as you wrote, you articulated it already. I mean, it's amazing considering that your topics are my topics, that we haven't crossed paths before, but here we are.
Well, that is probably because I'm a much smaller player in the field, and that's one of the reasons why I'm delighted to have you on board, because it will be fascinating to hear about your stories and about your journeys and challenges. So where are you joining me from? Are you in Austria at the moment?
I'm in Austria on our farm, that's right. I'm up under the roof because this is the place that's the most quiet, and also the background behind me is the meadow. You're going to have deer coming by, and people will be you will be distracted. The podcast will be audio, but you will be distracted, right? So this is a nice space where I can concentrate and see whether my English works, right?
Well, it's already much better than mine, so absolutely no concern about that. Yeah. So, where are you from originally, Adina? Are you Austrian?
Oh, well, no. I like to say that I was born in Hollywood because that's a place that everybody knows. I was literally, the hospital was in the district of Hollywood. So I was born in West Los Angeles, grew up in West Los Angeles, and went to my first year of high school in West Los Angeles. And then my father had work in Washington, D.C., and we all moved out to the East Coast. And then from the East Coast, I went to Oberlin College, which is in Ohio. You've probably heard of it, Oberlin College and Conservatory.
Hmm.
A
Yes,
very
uh, is it Jodie Kirschner is there that is teaching there? She's the new president-elect for ISME, I think.
well, I was there. I finished in 1980, so I'm not really up with.
With your alma
I'm not in
mater.
touch.
All
So
right. Okay, so you are American.
I am American. I'm still American, and yes, I am now Austrian. But I've been living in a German-speaking country since 1984. So it's been 41 years of speaking mostly German. I
Wow.
speak fluent German. When I speak on stage, I have to really speak without an accent. So I've pretty much conquered at least speaking in German. Of course, there are, as I'm sure if it's not your first language, there are like some grammatical mistakes that sort of just get stuck in there. And every time you're speaking, you think, gee, I always wanted to look that up, or I should ask somebody about that. And then
Mm.
the sentence is gone and then it's forgotten. So, but
Yeah, well,
yes,
yeah, that's pretty much the case with me as well. But the fun fact is that I grew up in Germany actually, and German was my first language. I went to kindergarten in Germany. I'm from Greece originally, um, but for reasons that are not necessarily exciting. When we went back to Greece, I was around the age of 5.5, and our parents and family tell us that we were we were treated quite unfavorably because Germany back then in the early 70s was not a particularly desirable place to be coming from. So we just stopped speaking for a couple of months and then started speaking Greek. So essentially, I acquired my mother tongue at the age of 5.5, which
Mhm.
some linguists claim that is not possible, but it perfectly is. So, and since I have relinquished every single German sentence and word and thinking, yeah, it's a very strange thing.
What's really fun is when we go back to the States for about a month, people would say to me, well, for somebody from Europe, your English is pretty good. And it takes me about a month, and then I start to slur words and mumble and use things like and whatever.
Yeah,
It's infectious, of course.
absolutely.
But
My wife Cynthia is from Arkansas, so whenever we visit during the first couple of days, the people there ask, "Oh, your English is so posh, and you sound amazing, and all of that." And then the twang starts coming back. But initially, she's offended because they ask her, "Where are you from?" She says, "What do you mean where I'm from? I'm from here."
that's right. That's right. Well, and then, of course, I had the extra challenge of I learned German. Well, it's a longer story. I had crazy German teacher in the States, or two teachers.
Mhm.
When I went to Germany, I went to school, night school, to try to perfect the language. Anyway, long story short, when we moved to Austria, it was horrific because the Austrian German is not the same as High German. So here, the things like month and pencil have different genders. Different words are used for different things. The first couple of months when I was at the university in Graz, yeah, it's called the Kunstuniversität Graz, there were things I just didn't understand my colleagues were saying to me, and yet I would go into a lecture hall and I would give a lecture or give a talk, and the students would understand me, but the minute they started to ask a question, oh, no.
Oh, wow. So was it initially studying that led you to Germany, or the love for the language? What, or combination of both?
Love is the right word, so I fell in love with a German,
All right.
and we were living in Santa Monica. We met sort of by accident. We rented an apartment together. It was actually a small house near the beach, just about a couple of blocks from the ocean, and we were first roommates, and then we became partners, and then he exported me to Germany. So I like to say I went to Germany for a month or forever, and it turned out to be quite a long time. I was in Berlin for 22 years before I finished my doctorate and then got my first professorship in Graz. And I was in Graz and we moved down here. And I was in Graz for 4.5 years before I applied for the position in Munich. And when I got the position in Munich, it was sure that I was going to have an apartment there, but that I would still live here in Austria. And it was the right decision. So
All right.
here we are.
Well, I have to say, when I came, I think it was 2004 for a conference in systematic musicology that Richard Pankart was organizing
Mhm.
In Graz. I fell in love with the place. To me, it looked like a kind of fairy tale place.
That's
Yeah,
right.
I couldn't believe that people kind of live and work there. It looked like a very surreal place to me. Yeah, I had a lovely time and have very good memories from that conference.
Yeah, and we lived there I think for 10 months, we lived right down there in the center of Graz. So everything was walking distance, and you're absolutely right. I mean, it's the only place I've ever been in the world where if I'm walking through the town square and I hear somebody talking about Beethoven and I turn around and you expect to see, in other countries, you expect to see like older people with gray hair and look like they're retired or whatever, and they're younger people. They're basically of the age that they could be professionals, and yet they're discussing Beethoven. And so I think the number used to be 55,000 students in Graz, so a good percentage of the population are students. So yes, quite a special place.
Yeah. The only other place in the world that has made me feel like that is Bergen in Norway. But there's a kind of similar surrealness to it.
Mhm, mhm,
Some kind of
mhm.
magic that you cannot pinpoint. You cannot really quantify or be deterministic about. It's a very nice place. Great. So where does one start? I mean,
That's right.
in trying to look at the things that you've done, it's as insane as I was thinking that my background is to kind of crave and look and explore different things. Is it? Are you inquisitive by nature, and are you happy to look at different things and investigate different things, or is it just the result of kind of coincidence and kind of the journey as a researcher? Did you always want to understand how things work?
Right. Well, this is giving me all kinds of ideas at once. So let me see if I can sort them out.
Yeah. Well, it's a very informal conversation, so
Right.
I
Okay.
would be glad
Well,
to explore
so
some.
the answer is yes and yes. The answer is yes. From a very early age, I was always curious about things. One of the first things I did that had anything to do with the research when I was a small child was and I don't remember what the teacher said, but anyway, my parents bought a dead chicken and then we cooked it down so we had the bones, and I tried to put the skeleton together because I was interested in how that worked. And I got almost finished, and then I discovered there was a bone missing, which is a funny way to tell you that I have one little sister who was extremely devilish. So that was the first thing that I remember doing that had to do with my wanting to know how things work, how things fit together. But shortly after that, I did an experiment in what they call honors biology. I don't know how many countries have this, but in Los Angeles, they separate out those who are learning at a very fast pace from those who are learning at a slow pace. As an educator, I have a different view of that now than I did just being part of the system. But anyway, as part of this honors biology class, I actually went to UCLA to the library and I read up on music and plants. And then I did a experiment in my backyard where I had 5 flats of corn seeds. And every day at noon, I had cassette recorders. Of course, you know what those are.
Mm.
Mm. I was recently in a concert and I held up a cassette tape to make sure that the audience knew what I was talking about. Anyway, so at 12 noon, I had it set up so that 4 of the 5 flats of corn seedlings would get music. And the one, of course, was my control. And the 4 musics, I hope I get this right. One was Bach, one was Mendelssohn, one was Gershwin, and one was heavy metal.
All right.
And then every day I went out and measured, and there were 50 plants. Pretty much all of them came up. There were 50 plants in each of those flats. And then I averaged them and did the math and whatever. That was easy math back then, of course. I wasn't looking for statistical significance. I was just looking to see what I could see with the naked eye. And as you might guess, well, let me say something about Gershwin first. I had read that there was a mango grower in Florida who blared Rhapsody in Blue to his mango trees every day at noon. So that was the inspiration behind this. My Gershwin plants did okay. My heavy metal plants didn't. Bach and Mendelssohn thrived. So this is my roundabout answer to say, yes, I was always interested in the intersection of music and science, and I was always asking myself, why is this? Why is that? And I most certainly started to think in that direction when I started to teach and found myself doing things and saying things I'm talking about as a teenager. I found myself repeating what my teachers were doing, and I started to ask myself, is this the only way? And at the same time, I had a friend whose mother was a teacher. This was in Maryland, outside of Washington, D.C., who taught in the basement. And the basement room was windowless and smelled of mold. And I just said, I'll never want to be a teacher. This is a dead end. It's not of interest to me at all. And yet it was of interest to me. And so I had a rather convoluted path that took me from saying I want to do music, but I don't want to teach, finding out that I'm interested in teaching because I want to learn for myself and I would like to share that knowledge with my students about how learning works. And also this pretty much inherent due to my family life, my cultural background, my schooling, the people that I was involved with, an outsider's view of how education works and could work and should work, and always questioning this.
So that's fascinating. So was music self-inflicted, or do you come from a musical family?
Well, my father claims that he couldn't hear a thing, and if he liked a piece, he always asked if that was Beethoven. So father's side, sort of out of the picture. My mother did play the piano as a child, played the piano in my childhood, and I started playing, at least that's the story, and I think there's a photograph of me playing along as she practiced. And so at an early age, she figured that I was interested and took me to, fortunately, to a very good neighborhood teacher who taught me for about a year, but discovered that I was not playing the next piece in the book, but the next book or something. I was jumping over the pieces that she was giving me, and then she turned me over to the master teacher of the area. His name is Robert Turner. This is, of course, many decades ago. He was a former student of Rosalie and Joseph Levine at Juilliard, and it was hardcore Russian school. So
Right.
the practice time was clocked, and the rules were very specific, and the competitions were a must.
So a
And
proper
so I went.
disciplinarian then.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I have grappled with this my entire life because I know that I would never want to inflict the regimen that he inflicted on us, on my students, and yet I know that having been forced to practice scales and chords and Hanon and memorizing Hanon and transposing Hanon and all of these things, and there was once a month there was a quiz where you would not only play whatever piece you were working on, but also it was a drill. He would say, Adina, D major cadences in all three positions, or I don't remember, or Hanon number 6 in metronome mark 120 or something. So there was a lot of anxiety involved. It was a lot of correction, a lot of performance being rated and evaluated and competition and so on. And these were all things that were not attractive to me. And yet, the point I'm trying to make is to this day, I have terrific technique. To this day, I know the key signatures. And so I find as an educator this extremely difficult to balance wanting to keep your students motivated and have them do things that they consider are fun or productive. And yet you know that there's a basic, I'm not going to say drudgery, that's the wrong word, but there's a baseline of things you have to be able to do. And the only way to achieve that is to put in the work.
It's fascinating to me that you hit the nail on the head, really, with trying to keep the balance, especially if you are an educator that has kind of stepped above standard educational practice and is being metacognitive, or trying to understand how different things work, is the personal struggle between understanding that certain catalysts that are connected to disaffection are also having potential for greatness or for leading to effective development. And in many cases, it's tricky to bury the burden of knowing that the thing that might lead to disaffection is also the thing that actually would lead to a better development in whatever practice. I don't think that I have mastered that still.
Well, then, I mean, we're also talking about multiple generations of different types of students too.
Mm,
I remember I had one student. Well, let me cut ahead or snap ahead to my teaching in Berlin, where I was at the music school in a lower class district. It's called Wedding. So I had students coming to me whose parents were cleaning ladies and worked in the crematorium or were out of work, larger families, immigrant families, and of course some talented students that had been referred to me that wanted to play with me, and a lot of adults who were either coming back or had always wanted to learn the instrument because that education is very cheap in Berlin. These are public music schools,
mhm.
so they are subsidized by the government. Okay, and in all of those years that I was teaching there, and I had amazing experiences, like parents who brought their kid and they would say, "Here, teach my child how to learn." And I thought, I didn't like the way they did that, but they're actually right, that what we were doing in piano lessons was not only about music and about technique and dynamics and music history, it was also about how you tackle a problem, how you use common sense to help yourself, how you motivate yourself, and on and on and on. So I had some of these parents who at least saw a use in music lessons, and of course I had those who thought it was a great way to have a babysitter where you combine activities and keeping my child busy with, I can go out and shop while this child is doing this. But where I'm going with this is I had one student who really was a wake up call once for me because all three of her parents, meaning the divorced father, the stepfather, and the mother, all three of them were professional orchestra musicians,
All
all
right.
string players. And for her, practicing was as obvious and necessary and everyday as brushing your teeth. And there was such a contrast between those who had not experienced practice in their home and this one student of mine. And at the same time, I wrote an article, which looking back, I still think has value today, where I was talking about, are we music teachers the Luddites of today? Now, for people that are listening, I'm going back to the theories of Neil Postman, the American sociologist, who was talking about how, well, not only how childhood has changed, how learning has changed, how our idea of what there's a history of his about how schooling was developed, what school was for, and I can just recommend it to anyone who doesn't know it, especially his series of in a book. It's teaching as a, of course, uh, I'm
As a
probably hearing
researcher?
the teaching as a subversive activity. That's it.
All right.
Yeah, the word subversive just was flew out the window. Teaching is a subversive activity. So here I am with this one student who knew how to practice, and I thought it made it all the more clear how much work we have to do as music educators to even and establish a pattern of wanting to play the piano, and what does that entail, and how much energy do I need for that, and what is the kind of concentration I need.
That's very interesting.
And
S-
I
s-
even one last thing about this school, I went to the extent that I had many of my beginning students draw themselves at home at the piano. And it was fascinating to see that sometimes the piano was really small and next to the piano was a large television set. Or you would see the piano being enormous and the child being very small, or you would see children playing next door. And those things that were obvious for me and my family, where my mother played an instrument, my father was educated in actually with a PhD in education. So it was obvious that practice time, it had to be quiet. You had to support your child. You looked forward to the recitals. You gave that child feedback. And then I was confronted with all of these families that had absolutely no idea about that.
hmm.
And if we make a big jump and talk about a survey I did last month with pianists who found this survey online on practicingthepiano.com. They answered questions about performance venues and what kind of performance experiences they had. And I was shocked, believe me, shocked to see that only about 37% said that they had played as a child in a recital.
It is.
So no wonder that I've been making such a career of teaching people to cope with stage fright. How can you possibly imagine that next generations of performers are going to suddenly learn at an adult age what performance means or develop techniques to be able to feel comfortable on stage if they're not starting at an early age? And of course, if they are starting at an early age, I've been arguing for decades that it's the music teacher's responsibility to make sure that we aren't, now German's coming to my head, we aren't educating the next generations of students who have the same stage fright as their teachers, because we're doing exactly what our teachers are doing instead of approaching it from a different angle.
So that echoes and also dovetails to what you were saying earlier about not particularly critical teaching praxis. Do you feel that this is rather connected to the very basic human condition, which is to try to avoid turning on the critical mind and kind of feel safe within the autopilot of I'm just going to do the rudiments, or I'm just going to echo my own experience when I was a student? Uh, because
Well,
the
that's a good question. Let's separate the conscious from the unconscious here. Unconsciously, of course, we are avoiding moments where we are in the center of attention because that's biology. And the feeling of adrenaline flowing through our system and everything going haywire, hands shaking, heart beating, thoughts going out the window. This is something that's not necessarily conducive for feeling that I'm happy to be here on stage. That's part of it. That's an unconscious level of let's avoid these kinds of situations. And then there's a conscious level of, well, if I'm going to do it, I should. And that was pretty sloppy English, so I can see I'm getting back into the rhythm. If I'm going to be performing, what is it? What does it entail? And then looking around and saying, I don't have any role models.
Mm,
And maybe you noticed this in the I wrote a book which was originally it was my master's thesis, which was today we would say meta study. I looked at about 500 papers in German and in English on stage fright. That turned into my master's thesis, which then turned into a book, which then was the basis of what I've been teaching when I teach students how to cope with stage fright for decades by now. And it was amazing to see that everyone had asked the question of who gets stage fright on who gets stage fright, what are the symptoms, is there any quick fix out there? I had read things about people drinking celery juice. You've got people running up and down stairs. You've got people taking beta blockers. You have the whole gambit of people coping with this, and nobody asking the question of, well, how did that person prepare? And was the piece ready? Were they ready? Did they practice performing before they went on stage? Have they even thought about what it means to be a performer? And have they do they have any kind of background knowing what the body does and the mind and of course the emotions and your behavior? Those are the four components when you're set up for this situation. So all of these things taken together, of course, back to the subconscious, we default to what we've seen, observed, and experienced.
yeah,
And trying to break through that, trying to find a new method, trying to say, okay, that's maybe good for other people, or it may actually not be good for other people, but they don't know any better. And saying it's time that we music educators deal with stage fright ourselves so that we then have a path forward for our students where maybe in an ideal world, a young student who's on the cusp of puberty isn't going to go from that "Isn't this wonderful? I'm in the center of attention," kind of mode to, "Oh my goodness, everybody's watching me, and this could and what does my hair look like, and,
yeah,
what's my outfit look like when I'm sitting, and who's gonna notice the mistakes?"
yeah. It's funny because I I remember vividly that when I was having a discussion on a similar uh, or a neighboring concept with Diana Kenny in one of my previous episodes, uh, I offered the kind of pondering aloud about whether, therefore, one might hypothesize that trying to develop one's sociopathic traits might be a cure for stage fright or performance anxiety. Uh, I was just reflecting on my own personal experiences as a performer, as a blues and jazz guitarist and singer in the past, feeling very much jealous and very uh, kind of many times positively, but other times negatively envious about other band members or people that I was admiring when see them performing. When I had realized that the actual thing that I was attracted to was my realization that they didn't care about being judged. Whereas regurgitating any kind of situation in which I felt bad about my performance, in most cases, had to do with my own metacognition or kind of uh, evaluation, post hoc evaluation about how I did based on my own criteria, although in reality, no one in the audience might have noticed what was happening. Uh, so I was trying to tease out of Diana whether that might then be a reason to connect this to kind of benign sociopathic traits. I don't want I don't want to suggest that.
Well,
Uh,
I have uh, immediately something to say about that because I used to think, as you're now describing, I used to think if only I had studied jazz instead, then I wouldn't be at all worried about the right notes in the right time because there's this
completely the opposite.
opinion. Yeah, but there's this opinion that among classical musicians, that jazz musicians, that there are no mistakes. Now, I've heard this expression, there are no mistakes in jazz. It's all about how you recover from the notes that you play. But this is, and I think her name is Rayburn, Susan Rayburn, who's one of the few people who's done studies in stage fright on jazz musicians. And now I'm going to tell you an anecdote, true story. The great American jazz pianist Walter Norris was well, he left New York one evening after an incident with Charlie Parker before he was beaten up, and moved to Europe. And I met him in Berlin, and for a while we had well, I wouldn't say we had a collegial relationship where I asked him to teach me jazz, and we had a lot of conversations. Anyway, at that time, I was still working on my master's thesis, and one night he and his wife had invited me for dinner, and I was in the kitchen with his wife discussing something. She was opening a bottle of wine or whatever, and I said, I'm pretty much finished with my study on stage fright. And I said to her, so what do you think? Does Walter have stage fright? She said, oh, no, he doesn't have stage fright. Uh, Not at all. He's he's just wonderful on stage. I mean, you'd think he's a fish in his element or something like this. So we go back into the living room, and she pours that glass of wine, and then she leaves the room, and I say to Walter, "So Kirsten tells me you have no stage fright." And he said, "Well, that's true. I don't." And then there was a pause, and then he said, "But the night before, I always feel as if I'm gonna die." And that fit absolutely to the research that I've been reading about parachutists and how they visualize the performance the night before, and these age-old theories that I was writing about how you can prepare yourself
So it's
to.
an issue of labels then, not of notions.
Absolutely. Well, and also that it's a matter of timing. Are we only looking at stage fright as what happens what goes wrong is on stage? Which is what I like
Yeah.
to tell students. Everybody thinks everything that goes wrong on stage is stage fright, which is, of course, not true. Or are we looking at the preparation, which is, of course, long before that? Or are we looking at this, what we would call a dress rehearsal or the night before, where the visualization is taking place, where the body is getting ready for the performance, where we are. And I later used questionnaires and myself as a subject. I put on cables on myself and sensors, and I performed an entire concert with my physiological data going to my assistant through Bluetooth to look at how the body responds and when it responds. And
Oh, wow. So
I,
heart rate variability, or what were
that
you?
too, that too. In the end, you had to pour salt in the wound. In the end, I had the heart rate variability data and found out that poor me, just the musicologist and the musician, I had no idea that doctors had so much. Um, it was, what can I say? That there were so many arguments about how to measure heart rate variability.
Oh,
So
absolutely. And how
right,
to filter it, how to downsample it, and how to remove noise. It's yeah, it's
it,
a it's a pitfall.
but what I was looking at, of course, I knew that, and I had been to a really interesting lab in Bielefeld in Germany where they were working with patients with epilepsy by making their heart rate in the room uh, audible. So I don't remember whether it was the lamp or the desk or the bookcase, but it would start to sound an alarm when their heart rate started to get even, because that was right before the epileptic attack. So inspired by this, when I played the concert, I was looking for moments. I wasn't going to measure. I wasn't going to argue with the math. I was just looking to see, where did my heart rate get regular, because that would be a sign of anxiety and that would be a sign that something was going bad. And I got really excited because my whole theory was that, and maybe you have had the same experience, I thought we actually feel the mistake, or I would say the glitch, coming about 2 or 3 measures before it happens. I could feel in concert that maybe it was my concentration slipping, or maybe it was a change in my body, or I wanted to know. And I thought, I bet we can feel this. I could feel it coming, and I wanted to see, can I see it coming on the data?
Sometimes not only that, sometimes I felt like I had a similar experience as the one that I have from my severe acrophobia. So, which is the feeling that the thing is actually dragging me and making itself happen.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's like the edge or the voice kind of dragging you, and you're feeling that you're actually being pulled to the void.
Hmm.
Uh, so so there have been occasions where I had that feeling where I'm in full control, and I know that, and I know how to not make that mistake, but the mistake is self-manifesting, essentially.
Yeah, and so I mean, since then I have multiple theories about how this happens. Most notably, I studied attentional focus with Gabi Wolf, and we did this study that has been much cited, where we looked at where the focus should be, and it should not be on your fingers and on playing right, but it should be on the message, just to shorten this, on the external focus going out. But let me tell you what happened with that concert. So it was pretty difficult music. It was a challenging concert. It was music that I had performed multiple times. It was one of my programs. And I got upset with myself after that I had performed, before I looked at the data, because it's the paradoxical intervention, as they call it. I don't think I've ever played as well as I played that evening. So I was hoping to see a mistake coming, but there were no actual real big mistakes in this performance. I didn't feel, actually, it was one of my better performances. Well, just leave that as it is. So I go to the data, and I see this one moment where my heart is beating in a pretty regular fashion. And I go to the tape and I look, what was I doing in that moment? And lo and behold, it wasn't one of these absolutely unplayable pieces that I was playing, because I was playing the Victor Ullmann sonata. I think it's the fifth that he wrote in Theresienstadt, and it's basically, it was supposed to be a symphony. It wasn't really written to be played on a piano, and very challenging and full of musical references, and anyway, very, very dense work. But it wasn't during that piece, which is almost unplayable. You have to do the best you can. It was before that piece where I was telling the audience, and the same thing's going to happen to me when I tell it again. I was telling the audience about how, in the last minute before Victor Ullmann was transported to Auschwitz, he left his scores with the librarian in Theresienstadt, where they survived the war, in the wall where the librarian hid them, and were discovered decades later.
Oh, wow.
and how that was how Victor Ullmann survived, if you will. His He is gone, but his music survived because of that premonition. Nobody knew in Theresienstadt where the transports were going. That's what they were called, where the trains were going. And the moment that I told that story, the moment I talked about a train leaving for Auschwitz, my heart went into panic mode.
Was it the emotional burden about the importance of of communicating this music appropriately and in honor of that story?
I would say that happened afterwards. While I was telling the story, I was feeling the anxiety of this moment where he decided to leave his manuscripts there and not take them with him. And but when I played the piece, and I have thought about this many times again, I played this piece multiple times. This one, as I said, was one of my best performances. Actually, I feel as if there's no room for ego because I'm just the middleman or a middlewoman, if you will, between the composer and the audience. And
The
I basically,
conduit.
right, I'm the conduit that's allowing Ullmann's music to be played and heard in the current time. So it's less about me. And in fact, I don't know if you've thought about this, but I've been watching the Pope. I'm not Catholic, but I've been watching the Pope and these enormous events. And I've been thinking, this is pretty much the same thing. The Pope doesn't seem to be nervous because he has a higher cause. I wasn't nervous when I was performing Victor Ullmann's sonata because the higher cause was allowing his music to be alive in the present day and live on in the hearts and minds of the listeners. So this is a larger picture argument for external focus, where you're not only focusing on making the music, what the music is expressing, reaching out to the audience, reaching the audience with your music, but you're also thinking of yourself as this intermediary, this conduit. And it's not so much about whether your dress is pretty or your shoes are nice or how many people are in the audience or how perfectly you play. It's about, are you actually doing something with the music that is worthwhile?
Wow. So do you think that this can only be the case then when you are dealing with the situations that are as important or as precious as this one? Or is there a way that we can use this as an educational tool in order to try to support people in essentially adopting a meta perspective of what is the context, what is the ecology, and what is the purpose of this?
I would say obviously it's the second, because not everybody is going to be elevated to the Pope, to the job of Pope, and not everybody will be playing music that has such a horrific, if you will, past as the sonatas of Victor Ullmann. It gives us, though, a window into an extreme situation, the Pope speaking in front of hundreds of thousands of people who are tuning in. I actually had John Wallace, who was the solo trumpet player who played at Lady Diana's wedding way back when, in front of an audience. Just the number is so big I can't even remember it. I had him come and speak at one of my conferences, art in motion conferences, where the topic was performing under pressure, and that was definitely the high pressure moment. So not each of us are going to have a Lady Diana wedding or a mass on the Petersdom to be performing at, but we can say these are instructive examples that show us that we can transcend our own nervousness if we make sure that we are externally focused and we are concentrating on what we can give to the audience as opposed to what the audience is doing to us.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
I actually asked a group of students last week whether they could imagine that the audience would want their money back if they felt you didn't play well, or whether the audience was coming to listen to you play because they wanted to see you make a mistake so that they would somehow feel better. There's a German word that's everywhere, Schadenfreude. So are people going to the concert because they want to see you fail, or are they going to the concert and paying their money because they want to hear something new? They want to experience something with you. And I think that's attitude, aside from the skills you need to develop in order to be able to perform, the attitude, the mindset, the focus, those are the most important ingredients of being able to feel good on stage and to give those performances that you feel good about afterwards. And so it's not only that momentary feeling, it's also something you can verify later when you listen to the tape or when you talk to the audience.
So is a good music teacher therefore in need of being a good neuro-linguistic programmer?
Yeah, I think you could say that. And I even have been for years, and I think I'm been ostracized from the group for things saying like things like this. But I've been teaching teachers how to teach. That's my was my job, and I've been saying we have to get away from this always correcting in lessons. There's more to music than just the right notes in the right time with the right pedaling in the sense of a pianist. We have to get away from this mindset. And I'm sure that you know about this study that they did with, I believe it was Rebecca Luthwaite who did this. They went into, I think, kindergarten, and they had a group of students where they said it was about drawing. And they had one group where they said, "Boy, you're really talented. You draw well." And the other group, "You drew this well." And but I've been teaching my teachers how to teach in my class. I've been saying we have to stop telling students how good they are or how well they've played or that something was terrific. We have to work with them so that they can discern it themselves, so that they have a higher goal than just hitting the right notes at the right time when they play.
So developing a critical thinking and kind of their metacognitive skills to assess their own output and their own work.
That's part of it, but also not being implanted, or I should say inundated with this right and wrong thinking model.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, how many students have you had where they have played a wrong note, doesn't matter whether they're in a lesson or on stage or at home practicing, and they shake their head? Because we've been taught that mistakes are bad, and I want to show the teacher through the head shaking that I know that that wasn't correct so that they don't interrupt me, whatever. We develop bad habits because we're so critical with ourselves, and we're judging ourselves against this impossible to reach 100% perfect.
That's funny that you mentioned that, Adina, because to me, that type of realization was uh, when it's slapped me on the face when I saw the differences between the kind of conservatoire and institutionalized music tuition that I decided at a very late stage actually to subject myself to because I decided that I wanted to become a musician when I was 20 and seek formal education through a conservatoire. But during that time, I also became very much attracted to the blues and jazz scene in my hometown. But for a very strange reason, I kept these two worlds completely separate, and I was looking at them completely separately.
Mm.
So I had the luxury of experiencing things like that in the conservatoire, where people would make grimaces when they were taking the wrong note, or where they would raise their hand when they would sing the wrong note in the choir, or they would have to fess up to their mistake in order to continue. Uh, but then I would be fascinated with famous blues musicians that would hit a completely out note and make a grimace and enjoy it, or actually acknowledge it and repeat it in order to see whether they could explore taking that on board and doing something with it. Uh, and in many cases, I mean, some extreme cases, where you could see that people were not just curious about that, but also entertained and looking forward to doing similar things again and again. Uh, that's perhaps why I rehearse the kind of notion of sociopathy in a benign way, because to me, it was something that I could never imagine that I would ever allow myself to to come into, and and expose myself to in front of an audience with trying to be that kind of playful in front of them without knowing what the very deterministic outcome of what I'm trying to communicate might be. It was a very interesting realization to see the two different worlds, and that was what gradually uh, let me become so attracted to the kind of blues and jazz scene, which was the main focus on the expressivity instead of the performance of the score,
Mm.
which I know now that is not that it was a similarly kind of Philistine way to look at classical music. This the same way that you presented that classical musicians are ignorant about what actually happening in jazz. So there's similar stereotypes the other way around. But nevertheless, I did feel very much attracted to that kind of relinquishing the kind of burden of having to execute something the way that it's expected from you to execute it by a kind of grey-haired professor behind a desk in a
Well, and I mean, that's a pretty good recipe for killing the music long term. If, and I've said this to many a student, if you don't know what you're teaching beyond the right notes, why? Why are you doing it? What is the energy that you're using to motivate yourself to teach, and what are you doing to ignite that fire within the students that they would want to play music also beyond the lesson or beyond the next exam or beyond the next recital if you have one? As I said, I was until last week, I thought everybody had recitals. As a child, I didn't realize that our lives these days are so overprogrammed and our priorities are so skewed that parents will pay for months and years for lessons and not expect that part of that is also the extra effort of preparing for a recital, going to a recital, listening to a recital, listening to other kids and musicians play. It's a pretty much almost a it's gotten too capitalistic, if you will. It's just about, returns. I want
yeah,
returns on my investment.
it's very interesting. I mean, sometimes it does feel like this. Some other times it is I think that it's a misunderstood uh, notion of not wanting to subject your child to things that might be kind of stress-inducing, which I think is not terribly informed, because that's not the point of doing a concert or doing a recital. Uh, but I
Wait a
think
minute,
that
but that's the key. Exactly what you said. It's stress inducing because the teacher, even if it's for beginners, is not talking about what it means to perform for others.
Hmm.
And you have these wonderful situations where young children get that rush of adrenaline when they're on stage and they play better than they played before. And they think, oh, this is what performance is about. All I have to do is just be really charged and then I'll find all the right notes. Until, of course, the opposite happens and they don't find any notes, but that's another story. Or they start to become self-aware, and then that goes out the window, and they also discover that without preparation, you really can't play a more difficult piece. So, but just to come back for a second to what you were saying about these two worlds, I think that's what's fascinating for me about um, John Baptiste, a musician who continually plays. When I hear him play classical music, it has the same enthusiasm and the same freedom as his jazz
Yeah,
does, but that doesn't mean that he's skewing the tempi or sloppy with the notes or whatever. It's that he's got that joy within him and it comes out through the music. And I think this is the one of the biggest failures of music teachers at all levels, which is to remind people that they're there to enjoy it, which doesn't mean that there isn't hard work involved. I mean, when you go to I grew up near the beach. If you go to the beach and you see children building sandcastles, they are playing, but they look serious and they will work for hours until they get the sandcastle finished. And then the wave will come and it's gone and they start over, right? Maybe someone will cry, but most of them will start over. But we don't have that attitude when we're practicing something. We're waiting for success to kick in. It's very confusing because with other things You do. I argue with my husband because he's a painter, an artist painter, and I say, when you finish painting, it's still there. When I've played a concert, I can play the next concert. It's even if I've recorded it, the experience was only once. It goes out the window. So
Yeah.
again, we need to expand what we're offering our students so that they understand that this is not just another school activity that's graded in a different way.
Yeah.
But
I think that to a great extent, this is exactly what attracted me to music technology from an early stage, which was exactly the passion to have an artifact at the end of the day that you can listen to again, with the full understanding that you can never replicate the context and and the venue and the interaction with the audience and the stress or anything like that in a kind of sterile digital deliverable, but it's still a very important thing to me, even nowadays. I've been doing it for 30 plus years, and I still record every single artist that I record or any kind of event with the same enthusiasm and the kind of same joy that this is actually capturing a magical moment in time and being able to revisit it. Uh, but well, the question, therefore, is then, with the power of hindsight now, what would you do, or how would you advise for someone to take all of this wisdom on board and either become a more effective educator or use these skills or this kind of distilled knowledge in order to be much more effective in helping other people become better musicians, whatever that means?
I think it might start at what is actually motivating that student to come to you for lessons. Is it the socially acceptable thing to do because everybody else in the neighborhood is doing it, so your parents are carting you off to the lesson? Or is it your own? I spoke about adult beginners or adult returners. Is it because of your own inner motor that you want to do it? Or is it because you heard something? Many great musicians have talked about this, the moment that they heard something that they knew they wanted to be a musician. It was a particular performance, or it was an encounter with a particular person. And these peak experiences, I guess is the term for it, these peak experiences are something that I think are important to cultivate in a student, to say, okay, I want to remember that that's what I'm there for. That's what I'm there to do. Are there a set of performances that I've been to that I can remember the feeling of enjoying the connection between the artist and myself? And this can be any kind of music. It can be jazz, it can be improvisation, it can be the the Goldberg variations I heard once
Mm.
in Berlin, Daniel Barenboim. Actually, I'm going to tell this story. I didn't want to go because at that time, Barenboim was playing every concert possible. He was conducting the orchestra, he was accompanying singers, he wasn't really practicing enough. And then my friend who worked at the Philharmonic Hall said, I have tickets for the Goldberg variations. And I said, it's one of my favorite pieces. I've studied it myself. I don't want to hear it be butchered. And she said, yeah, but it's for free and I want you to go anyway. So I went. And he came out on stage and he played not only the piece, he played every repeat, and every repeat was different, and he still managed to, the only time I've ever heard it, from the very first note to the very last note, to draw a line.
Oh, wow.
The audience was spellbound. There was not a pin dropped. Nobody, usually you hear shuffling or something, nothing. And 2 rows in front of me were a set of nuns, and they were praying. And remember thinking to myself, are they praying to Bach? Or are they praying to Barenboim? Are they praying to God? What's going on here? But it was just one of those experiences
So a
where.
holistic flow then.
Mhm.
Amazing.
Right. And so that's one of the problems, I think. I mean, not criticizing technology, but this is one of the problems. If you do not go out and hear live music, at least in the f- formative years where you're trying to discover what it means to be a musician, you're not experiencing that special something that happens when you connect with an audience. That group experience of you're being in a trance, you could almost say, of this Goldberg variation experience.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. My daughter, who is 17 now, we have been offering her music tuition since she was preschool, so three and a half. And she's a cellist now and quite accomplished. She's about to give her grade 8 exam. And she has been playing in the junior orchestras in our borough here in North London. She's already performed 3 times at the Royal Albert Hall. The first time I remember it vividly, it's a long time ago. It's about 10 years ago now. The first time that we went in a hall and we were quite intimate because it was a small ensemble, but we were sat right with them, even that small ensemble. And the sound kind of hit me so intimately and so closely, sitting next to the children. Uh, to me, it was a religious experience. I felt very emotional about the fact that my child had the opportunity to experience the thing that I had never experienced at that age. And I felt very positive about being able to kind of be part of this catalytic context. It's an incredible thing. Yeah. So I absolutely don't think that this can be replicated with a recorded performance. I just feel that there are certain things that at least can act as logs of that experience, whatever that experience was.
I mean, I have had listening experiences where something was really that sensational that I thought this is the closest that I can get to a live performance.
Mm.
There's a DVD out there called "The Making of West Side Story." I don't know if you know about, right? Do you know about this? Where Bernstein went to New York in the summer and they asked him to conduct the score of West Side Story. If you don't know it, and for anybody listening, it's absolutely an amazing performance because what they did was they chose the best musicians who were in New York to come and form this orchestra. It wasn't a set orchestra. And then you had Bernstein conducting, and there are things you can hear in that particular performance or performances of this music that you, of course, never know from the film score because that was more of a normal orchestra. You have these specialized musicians, and you have this enthusiasm of Bernstein. Anyway, this is so. And that I only, obviously, I wasn't there. I wasn't in New York in whatever, I think it was 20 years after he wrote it. So I think it was in the 80s. No. So, but you asked me something and we should come back to this. So one thing is to figure out what the motivation is. And is there some key you can have for each student that you can turn when you feel that their motivation is slipping, where you say that, remember that performance or remember that goal that you were going to and exposing them. I mean, even sometimes it can be listening to other students perform that can give them an additional motivation. But that's part of it. The next part, if I'm advising teachers about what to do differently, is to get away from this music is like math. There's a right answer. You can solve the formula and you have the answer.
Hmm.
and and also to expand what you're teaching beyond just whatever repertoire needs to be practiced by next week or whatever has to be played in the Christmas recital or the under the Christmas tree or wherever people are celebrating or at the next birthday party. And it it seemed to have worked for the students that I've had, and the perspective that I've hopefully been giving the future generations of music teachers about training your students that there's more than just waiting for the response of the teacher. These horrible feedback loops of I go to the lesson, there's small talk, I play the piece, I get criticized, I get my homework assignment, I go home, I come back to the lesson, and it's always the same over and over and over again, instead of saying, okay, we're going to do a project this month. We're going to play forehand music. I've done things where talk about the Goldberg variations. All of my students, different levels, each of them got a Goldberg variation to learn. And then we came together and tried to compare how the variations sounded. So that the project wasn't about accurate reproduction, or it wasn't about performance, it was about deepening our understanding of the music. And I think that if we can realize that we're making up for things that used to be normal in families. I don't know about you, but in my family, my parents listened to music. My mother, especially, she listened to classical music. I remember dancing to Carmina Burana with my father through the living room when I was a child. I mean, music was part of life, it was normal. Now, let's move forward a couple of years, and I'm teaching in Wedding, Berlin, and many of those families didn't have books, they didn't have records, they didn't have CDs, they didn't have anything, and I was lucky if they actually bought the piano or rented the piano that their child needed to be able to learn the piano. And of course, I'm sure you know about those families that buy some kind of electric keyboard that's only about this, a couple of 2 octaves long, and they think that, well, that let's see if my child is talented. I love that.
Yeah. Yeah, there's yeah. I don't think that we have too much time for getting into the nature versus nurture debate as well as everything else that I wanted to rehearse. And I'm aware that I've been torturing you for an hour now. So uh, unless we develop a series where we have hourly discussions about every one of those bullet points, I'm gonna be dissatisfied. But anyway, uh, it's a very familiar thing that I'm with, particularly because many of these cases, because of the hat that I'm wearing of the technologist, um, many of these parents would drop an email to the technology guy saying which one of these keyboards should I buy for my child. So, so I've had many a discussion regarding this, um, but it, it also dovetails to the experience that I've had researching or being part of the team that was researching the impact of the National Singing Program in the UK, which was a government-funded initiative, uh, and it was solely focused on singing, but
Mhm.
it was very interesting to visit schools and work with children in trying to assess the kind of level of the vocal development. Um, and our team made a number of very interesting realizations and observations, mainly because we had a vast sample of 13,000 students, 13,100, something like that. And one of the things that we realized, of course, was that the culture can change by a single person in a whole school. And in a postcode of profound deprivation, one school can be the worst in the country, and the neighboring school can be the best in the country. Having students from exactly the same socioeconomic backgrounds. But what you're saying came very loudly and proudly as one of the observations where we were dealing with children from families where music was frowned upon as an activity because of the cultural or religious background. So we could see the direct impact that this had to the actual vocal development, their speaking range, their singing range, but also their sense of self and social inclusion, which is highly correlated to
Mhm.
kind of musical ability as well. Uh, so it was fascinating to observe that throughout the whole country and see how this is connected to well, essentially the baggage coming from home and what kind of level of support one receives. In some cases, what level of catalytic negativity one receives, because sometimes it's not the support is exactly the opposite. Um,
Yeah, here's a German word for you. Maybe I'm obnoxious with this, but I like to point out the German word for voice is Stimme, and the German word for mood is Stimmung. And I think this is really interesting that they have the same base, because your voice is also telling the listener something about your mood. So absolutely, it correlates to how you feel about yourself, what your background is, what your practices have been, how you've been instructed or not instructed, what other people have said about your singing before that, all of that fits in. There's a tagline to the movie Rhythm Is It with Simon Rattle and the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra.
Mhm.
And the tagline is, "You can change your life in a dance class," because the project was both dance and music. And I think we can change that tagline. You can change your life in a music lesson.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That comes back to what I was saying about parents saying, teach my child how to learn. I think that I'm the last person who says that you get more intelligent or you develop other skills or you should use music to become a better person, or people who in poor countries who become musicians aren't going to become thugs or thieves or whatever, because that's all not true. And you also shouldn't be using music as a means to some other ends. But I can say that in your own personal development, a music lesson can be a, a, a moment where you pivot from one fate to another.
Yeah, I completely agree. And passionately agree. But it's very true. I mean, many times the arts in general, but music specifically, sometimes needs to, some other times is, without the need to, is being terribly apologetic and is trying to celebrate the other than musical benefits of engaging with music. I don't know whether that is because we want to please funders or policymakers or whatever. Uh, and I was terribly passionate because I was one of the critics of some fairly sketchy studies that were published some years ago that were pretending to be meta-analyses of the value or the effectiveness or whether music makes a difference. And the methodological approach in doing so was to essentially dismiss or discard 99.9% of anything that has to do with research in music and music psychology and simply cherry pick things that are randomized control trials in order to then meta-analyze only these, which I find the most bizarre kind of approach in that. But in doing so, I became gradually militant about trying to maintain the focus on convincing people that they need to relinquish that apologetic attitude in being musicians or celebrating the value of music. And I think that you might have come across a 900-page book that I was very honored to be part of, that I published with Sue Hallam a couple of years ago, which we call The Power of Music, which we presented as just an exploration of the evidence, not as a meta-analysis or a systematic review, exactly for that reason, because many times just the lived experiences or the stories told are powerful enough to celebrate something that is not necessarily going to be observed in a lab by people that are wearing a lab coat. Um,
And let's say what at the core of this may even be, and this is almost a oxymoron. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but it's definitely a conundrum when you think of classical music means reproducing a score, and yet you can learn to be creative by learning classical music. Does that make any sense? Is that
mhm,
impossible? Can we put those two words in the same sentence? I think my answer has been, and I've struggled for a long time because I thought only jazz musicians and pop musicians and dancers who are improvising are being creative, and painters and sculptors, and we're just reproducing the score and there's no creativity involved, until I realized that, and maybe this was also due to my experience with composers where I was doing world premieres of their works and I would invest my time in their music, not just sight reading it, but actually learning it by heart, if you will. And then the composers were saying to me, "Oh, that's something I didn't hear in there," or "You're bringing out something that nobody else has. And I started to discover this as these are small moments of creativity that allow me to feel as if the music is mine and the expression is, well, it's the same thing with language. I'm not inventing the words as I choose them, and yet the words are allowing me to express something. So the score is basically the language, and it's allowing me to make a statement. And that statement can be creative if it's coming from me personally.
That's fascinating. But I mean, I would hate to lose you or close the discussion at least without having 2 minutes of rehearsal of the connection between music and aviation psychology. I'm fascinated about that. I mean, uh, what can musicians learn from aviation psychology, Adina?
Okay, the bottom line is pretty easy to explain. In aviation psychology worldwide, you have researchers who are looking into what happens when the airplane is flying, the pilots are, you know, doing their thing, not on autopilot or with autopilot, whatever they're doing, they are navigating the skies, okay? If something goes wrong, and especially if something almost goes wrong, but they catch it in time, you have a network worldwide of people not saying who's at fault, but what happened. And the most central thing in everything that I've discovered through aviation psychology is that we have to start asking ourselves after a performance, what happened? What went right? Which is a question almost nobody can answer because they're only trained to listen for the mistakes. So, what went right? And if something didn't go optimally well, why? And the why is not to find an excuse, but the why is to see, can I track down what happened in that moment so that I can adapt a different training strategy or I can prepare myself in a different way so I can actually change my performance so that the probability of this happening again is very small. Because you have, on the one hand, you have aviation that says it's not the individual who is at fault, it's the combination of the individual interacting with the instruments, in that case, the airplane or the software or the rules of society, the weather at the moment, the commands of the control tower, all of these things that are working on them. And I work to see how we can apply this to music because we have, of course, the audience, we have musicians that are playing with us, we have the score, which is more or less the software we're trying to reproduce, we have the hardware, which is our instrument or our voice. And after a performance, we're always saying, what did I do wrong? Why wasn't I well enough prepared? I should have practiced more, all of these negative statements, instead of saying, gee, this is interesting. What is this mistake telling me about my perception in that moment? What is it telling me about my concentration at that moment? What kind of window is it giving me towards things that I can practice that I haven't been practicing yet? And I find it, as I said, this whole shift away from that pilot is at fault or that airplane has a malfunction, but to say aviation is built on redundancy, so you have backup systems, and it's built on practice and learning from others and learning from others' mistakes for the future. And we have none of that. I like to point out that even we've got soccer championships right now, even in sports, you have a whole nation behind the sports team that's either extremely elated or just depressed beyond belief, depending on how their sports team does. They have people behind them, they have trainers, they have psychologists, they have physical therapists. And what do we have? We have ourselves, right? And orchestral musicians, especially, if they don't perform up to par, there's a whole group of musicians who are just waiting to get a chance to audition for that spot. Or you have a solo performer and they say, well, the promoter's not going to invite me back. There's no system of learning, improving, expanding, and there's certainly no precedent within music lessons that I know of, especially not at university level, that is saying it's not your fault that that happened on stage. It's something bigger than you, and let's take a look at it and let's see if we can't find it. So that's basically how I ended up writing a dissertation on applying the methods of aviation accident uh, studies, examinations to the stage.
Do you think that one of the reasons that people hadn't put two and two together before you conducted this kind of work is mainly because the stakes are high in the aviation world and if things go wrong in aviation, then lives are lost. Whereas if things go wrong in education, it is very difficult to find the causal pathways or to see actual forensic evidence of how the patients or the victims have been affected by things going wrong.
I mean, absolutely. If there weren't lives, if it was if it weren't about people's lives, I don't think there would be this energy. But that's why it's such a good example for us musicians because we can say don't have to go back to ancient Rome and have the gladiators out there and say that, one wins and one is dead, here in music. So it's not about that. But it is about trying to zoom out from your own personal perspective and saying, this is not about dodging responsibility for my preparation, but it's about seeing that any given moment on stage is a product of multiple factors. And just to say that it was a bad day or a bad night or somebody coughed or I was distracted or this it's very humid today, the piano was sticky, I couldn't play as fast as I could. I mean, all of these things. We tend to stick to the superficial and we don't look at how we had prepared ourselves mentally and physically and also, of course, through practice for that performance.
That's fascinating. So, are these the kinds of things that you wanted to explore further when you decided to found your conference series? Did you have a particular focus in mind, or was it a much more kind of encyclopedic craving to essentially network and socialize and fraternize and uh, interact with researchers in general? What?
Interesting question. So let's go back to the year 2008. I'm fresh. Actually, the conference was in 2008. So let's think 2007. I'm freshly cured professor in Graz at the university, and the administration says to me, "Wouldn't you like to put on a symposium?" At the same time, I had made contact with the sports psychologist Gabriele Wolf, who was doing attentional focus studies because I heard somebody at a conference in Germany referred to her work. So I wrote to her and she wrote back, and we were in communication. And then she came to a performance I gave at Marymount University or college. Anyway, in Los Angeles, she came, she met me there, drove out from Las Vegas, and we decided to do some research together. And then I discovered that there were many more correlations between what she was looking at in terms of motor learning and what I was looking at in terms of how we play an instrument. And so this idea of motor learning is what we have in common. And of course, performing as an under pressure and the topics that have developed since then. But it started with this idea of she's an expert for motor learning. She was working with Richard A. Schmidt, Dick Schmidt, who is basically the father of the system with which we study motor learning today, which was just fascinating because I was able to invite him to the conference. And I said, if this is just the tip of the iceberg of all these things we could learn from decades of studies that we're not even running with musicians, then we really have to get together and start listening to one another. And at the same time, I was getting the impression from Gabi that there were things that I had discovered. Let's just stick to the easy example about stage fright that were absolutely applicable for sportsmen and women. And I started to stretch out my tentacles and look at colleagues who were in the sports sciences, and there was that equal interest. And also, especially here in Austria, many musicians play sports, and many athletes play musical instruments or sing, because the music is in Austria much more a social thing, much more uh, just it's not even a question of if, it's a question of when.
Hmm.
So I moved to this crazy little village in Southwest Styria, and the local brass ensemble, basically everybody plays in it, small and large, whatever. And that's the job of the conductor, is to create this mutual sound and this joy of making music. So this is, in a way, living in Austria is sort of a setback, a couple of decades to when music was still important to social life, when music was still important to mental hygiene, when music was still a way that you express yourself. And so I had this wonderful opportunity to have this first conference, and little did I know that now, so many years later, I'm going to be having the 10th conference next year. So it's been, yeah, over 20 years of working on this topic, that people were hungry for interdisciplinary conversations. I mean, this is an interdisciplinary conversation that we're having right now. There are many people who don't want to put technology in the same sentence as science, as education, as music, as art. And there's this belief that you cannot explain art or music through science, that you would somehow degrade it, creativity, if you were able to, if you came up with a formula for it, although that's not absolutely not the point, of course. And then we also have this idea that education is what it's been up to now, as opposed to we're here right now on this planet and we should be changing what education means for for the current generation so that they change it for the next generation.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's one of my vices to try to convince people that technology is not just the ephemeral tools used so that we can continue delivering Victorian education and music. Yeah,
And I mean, I'm the last person the minute that I got my first laptop and I got my um, software for Keynote, I started using visuals in my presentation. So I use as I said, I live with an artist. I use the visual arts not only in my concerts. I've done concerts in um, openings of galleries, in museums next to dinosaur bones. I've gone out there and performed in all kinds of different spaces. But I just think it's so important that we come back and say there are tools out there that can be really useful for transmitting music, for inspiring people to make music. And of course, today is the big discussion about artificial intelligence. And I think it's just a wake up call that we educators have a responsibility to remind everyone we're working with about the human spirit, that the best bot on earth and the best software on earth will never be able to imitate.
absolutely, absolutely. Well, I think that this is a closing remark that should not be tarnished by anything else coming out of me as a question. So uh, it's it's a it's a very sharp and very important conclusion. I think that well, I have been accused in the past of appearing to be somewhat nihilistic when I was trying to explain to people that in the phylogenetic journey of the music in humanity, uh, where we actually place the zoom point or the dot to what we perceive or what we interpret as technology makes very little sense and is not important at all. Uh, because depending on where you place that zoom factor, even if you're using the paper or a mirror to look at your posture when you're singing, or if you're using a synthesizer or a Pentium or an iPad, you are already talking about 0.0005 of anything that has been invented as part of the music in humanity anyway. So it really leads to a different discussion. And in most cases, has to do with people's personal thresholds or personal fears about how they perform or how they compete based on what they see others doing when they're using different tools. So it's very much either a narcissistic or a kind of self-perception debate, and not really a pragmatic debate about whether something is technological or not. So I I was never burdened by the by the tyranny of whether I am a contemporary musician or whether I'm a classical musician or not, or whether a particular tool should be used within the Royal College of Music, or whether a different tool should be used by different types of people from different socioeconomic backgrounds and different vision. Uh, but obviously, it is very easy to appear as nihilistic when you kind of try to flatten everything, because things are galloping nowadays, especially with the advent of AI, and things are changing, and music is changing. Um, but I think that everything can be used effectively and everything can be abused. And the most important part in this discussion is what our agency is and what our attitude is towards these challenges, not the tools themselves. I think that the kind of neophobic tendencies that are being introduced by some academics are terribly unhelpful nowadays when it comes to technology and that what the potential is. I think there's a general decline in ethos or how we deal with music and the arts, but I don't think that technology is the reason for that. I think it's just a very loud amplifier of what's happening. Hmm. So it's a space that I'm very very keen in monitoring closely, but I'm not convinced that we are at the edge of doom, as some people.
Well, as an afterthought, and you don't have to put this in the final recording or not, but I've been sort more or less ostracized by my colleagues in Germany because of my interdisciplinary voyages,
Mhm.
because of my trying to incorporate sociology in my thought, trying to ask the question that, as I said, it's not mine, it's Neil Postman's. What is this good for? What is his favorite question was, what is the question for which this is the answer? So if we ask ourselves, what role is technology playing in current society? What are the questions we had that technology is giving us the answers to, as opposed to what questions come up when we use technology? We have to see, is it really a tool, or is it something that where we become the tool for the technology? So the
It's an interesting debate, and to me, it is very interesting because it can go astray very easily. uh, because it harbors the threat of deviating the discussion to the centricity of the tool, which I find problematic. Uh, so my stance is that the technological humanity and the musical humanity are part of humanity, and there's nothing you can do about it. Uh, so trying to look at those things in silos just because it's convenient doesn't necessarily explain the human condition. Uh, but then again, different sociological debates, for example, a Bourdieusian view of the world would say, well, you're burdened by what your your class tells you that you are, and that's it. And then your preferences will be dictated by that, and there's nothing you can do about it. Which, again, I'm not necessarily convinced about.
Mhm, mhm.
So it's fascinating. Well, well, I have to say, Adina, now I feel even worse for not having met you earlier, and so I'm lamenting the discussions that were never had, but but I'm also excited about the possible discussions in the future. It was incredible to meet you, and I really need to make plans for your next conference because it would be great to be part of it. Uh,
Absolutely. And I would really like to welcome you to the event, and we'll have to just have another conversation about how that dovetails between what we're going to be discussing and what you've been researching, what you've been thinking, what you've been doing. And I must admit, this was a very pleasant interview because it's very unusual to have somebody with your worldview asking questions as opposed to somebody just say, well, just cough up your 5 different principles of thinking, or what is your teaching curriculum, or what are the things, what are the major milestones in your life. It was much more interesting to go back down a different path.
oh, absolutely. I always it's becoming somewhat of a not exactly a tradition because this is the fifth episode. This is going to be the fifth episode of the Mates podcast. So I don't want to appear as an institution, not at all. But for my first ever interview, which was I was very privileged to do with Jean Bamberger at the amazing age of 101 when just before she passed away. I did ask the final question, which was about having the power of hindsight, and what would you go back to advise your younger self to do or not to do? And I think it's becoming a bit of a tradition to do that. But I also don't want to corner you or surprise you with a question. Is there something particular that you feel that you would have informed your former self about after all these years and all this work and all the multidisciplinarity in what you have done?
My immediate thought, so if I don't filter it, my immediate thought is that for all of the things that was doing in my childhood that were unusual for my age, for my family, for my friends, for the society that I was living in, the things that were of interest to me, music was, or I should say my piano lessons was one area where I didn't ask questions. So, for example, my teacher told me that I wasn't allowed to play pop music, so I was secretly accompanying the choir at school, and I was secretly writing my own little musical. Don't even know where it went. I was secretly doing things outside extracurriculum activities, but I was told that they would be bad for my technique or they would be bad for my ear. And of course, this was the 60s and it was fantastic music out there to listen to. And so next to the record player that had the Carmina Burana record that was probably scratched to death, there were, of course, first the Beatles and then Simon and Garfunkel, and then the rock music came and so on and so forth. And if I would go back to that self, I would have said rebel earlier. I think I would have said, you are interested in all kinds of musics and you're limiting yourself to what your parents buy. Of course, I didn't have enough allowance to buy my own records, and I didn't back then. It was just the radio, maybe if I was lucky. So I was experimenting through friends. I had a really good friend who was a guitar player who would introduce me to all kinds of music I otherwise wouldn't hear and played for me. But I think I would have told myself, go out earlier and say you want to play something else. And now let's do a flashback. Had been in Europe for many, many years, and I went back to visit that music teacher, Robert Turner, as an adult. And I discovered in my conversations with him, he was very old and frail and died shortly after that. Not because of my visit. There was enough distance. It wasn't me. But I realized that he had absolutely no knowledge of music past, let's say, Debussy. I don't even think that I played Bartok with him. And I think that if I had rebelled earlier and allowed myself to either change teachers or demanded that my parents change teachers or had additional lessons maybe in jazz, I think that my musical horizon would have been expanded earlier and I would have maybe arrived at some of the conclusions that I've arrived at now in a much, much earlier age and at a moment where perhaps my life would have taken a different path. But having said that, I certainly don't regret the path that it took. And of course, every mistake that I've made or every alleyway I was sent into, any dead ends that I encountered, helped me help others find their way out of these.
That's amazing. Well, Adina, thank you so much for your time uh, and generosity. I had an absolutely fascinating time discussing these things with you. And I look forward to our next discussion. That's the only thing that I can say. I hope that there will be a future discussion. I'm not trying to emotionally blackmail you to be part of it, but it would be a great honor to continue this sometime in the future.
I'm absolutely with you because I think that there are moments where you feel as if there's so much to talk about that you can just feel your brain firing in all directions. And well, let's have a chance to go down some of those other pathways in the near future.
That would be fascinating. Thank you so much.